For 25 years now, America has lived with a heavy, lingering shadow and a really big question that we never fully answered. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a look back over the last quarter century, and we're going to do it with a thoughtful, historically grounded lens. For a lot of us, especially those of us old enough to remember that Tuesday morning clearly, the images from September 11th, they've never really left us. The collapsing towers, the dust, that deafening silence afterward, and then, of course, the decades of war that followed. It was a collective, emotional trauma that completely shaped an entire generation. But as we reflect on this somber anniversary, we want to respectfully examine a topic that was basically thrust into the American consciousness on that exact same day.
So what does Islam actually teach? Because after September 11th, something pretty unprecedented happened. Almost overnight, an entire religion, followed by nearly 2 billion people around the world, was suddenly inextricably associated with 19 men. Think about that. A global faith was reduced in the public eye to smoke, terror, and fear. Suddenly, widely misunderstood terms like jihad, which actually means struggle, and sharia, which refers to Islamic moral guidelines, were everywhere. But they were stripped of their actual theological meaning. Islam became the absolute center of America's foreign policy conversation. And yet, at the time, the reality is most Americans had never met a Muslim personally, nor had they ever even opened a Quran.
And this statement right here brilliantly illustrates the uncomfortable reality of that era. Most Americans formed their understanding of Islam during the single most emotionally traumatic moment in modern American history. Into that vacuum of knowledge rushed fear, political shouting, and highly simplified narratives. And, as we all know, when fear becomes the lens through which we view the world, complexity just disappears. The nuance is completely lost.
Part 1. The Unanswered Question. Looking at the Sources.
Okay, let's dive into this, because serious questions deserve serious answers. We're going to bypass the cable news outrage, the internet slogans, the political rhetoric, and we're going to look directly at the primary sources. This right here is the most direct, pressing question that was on the minds of millions of Americans in the days, months, and years following the 2001 attacks. When we bypass the extremists and actually look at the foundational texts of the religion, what do we find? Does the religion itself permit the killing of innocent people? The answer, straight from the primary source, is a definitive no.
In Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse 32, the Quran explicitly states, "Whoever kills a soul, it is as if he has killed all of humanity." This powerful verse became one of the most widely cited passages by mainstream Islamic scholars in the aftermath of 9/11. And they weren't just inventing something new to save face either. They were desperately trying to explain their 1,400-year-old faith to millions of Americans who were hearing about Islam for the very first time through the devastating acts of terrorists rather than through its actual scripture.
Part 2. What Islamic law says about the rules of armed conflict.
So Islam, much like Christianity and Judaism, does indeed contain a tradition that discusses war. But long before the Geneva Conventions or modern international law ever existed, classical Islamic law placed incredibly strict, non-negotiable limits on warfare. For instance, war could not be declared by rogue, random individuals. Non-combatants were fiercely protected. The Prophet Muhammad explicitly instructed his armies that women, children, monks, farmers, and civilians were never to be targeted. He ordered them not to destroy crops, not to poison water supplies, and not to burn homes unnecessarily. Groups like Al-Qaeda fundamentally violated Islam's own ancient legal traditions, all while falsely claiming to represent them.
This stark contrast here is absolutely vital. On one side, you have Osama bin Laden. The guy was not a trained classical Islamic scholar. He held absolutely no recognized authority within mainstream Islamic jurisprudence. On the other side, you have the actual recognized authorities of the Islamic world. Major historic institutions like Cairo's Al-Azhar University condemned the 9/11 attacks within 24 hours. Major Muslim organizations across America, Europe, and the Middle East immediately echoed that condemnation. But, emotionally, at the time, none of those official statements were powerful enough to compete with the terrifying images we were all watching on repeat on our televisions.
Part 3. Extremism versus mainstream Islam. How we separate the two.
We really have to carefully distinguish the 1,400-year-old mainstream religion of Islam from the modern political extremist movements that basically just hijack its language to serve their own ends. Treating them as the exact same thing completely misses the broader historical picture. The ideology behind groups like Al-Qaeda didn't just magically appear out of nowhere. Actually, it emerged from a highly specific political environment. It was birthed from Cold War conflicts, decades of authoritarian governments, foreign occupations, regional instability, and these really complex geopolitical struggles across the Middle East. Now, let me be absolutely 100% clear here. Understanding this context does not justify terrorism. Nothing justifies the murder of civilians. But serious, mature societies study root causes honestly, because true prevention requires actual understanding.
And that brings us to a crucial, often overlooked fact that many Americans just never heard clearly in the years following 9/11. The overwhelming majority of terrorism victims globally have actually been Muslims themselves. From Iraq to Syria to Pakistan to Afghanistan, Ordinary Muslim civilians have suffered enormously under extremist violence. They weren't simply passive observers of this conflict or sympathizers. They were, and they remain, among its primary victims.
Part 4. The Muslim American Experience After September 11th. Let's shift our focus back home to American soil for a minute. There's a whole other chapter of this story that so often gets lost in the big geopolitical discussions, and that is how Muslim Americans personally experienced September 11th and its aftermath. I want to pause on this sobering number for just a second. 72. That is the number of innocent Muslims who were killed in the attacks on September 11th. They were grieving as Americans right alongside the rest of the country. They were people just working at their desks inside the Twin Towers. They were heroic first responders rushing up the stairs to save lives. They were passengers on the hijacked planes. They bled and died that day, just like their fellow Americans.
But in the days and years that followed, the domestic aftermath was incredibly harsh for these communities. Many Muslim Americans found themselves grieving a massive national tragedy while simultaneously becoming objects of intense national suspicion. They suddenly had to prove they belonged in a country that was already their home. Mosques were vandalized, innocent families received threats, children were bullied in schools. It was a deeply, deeply painful era of suspicion.
And yet, despite that immense pressure and suspicion, Muslim Americans became increasingly visible and deeply vital contributors to everyday civic life. They are our doctors, our teachers, military veterans who proudly serve the country, police officers protecting our streets, local business owners, and, of course, our neighbors. They didn't retreat, they wove themselves even further into the diverse fabric of American life.
Part 5. A more honest conversation. Changing the narrative. As we move toward the present day, it's really worth examining how the last 25 years have shaped public perception and how real, face-to-face connection has finally begun to change the narrative. Data from Pew Research reveals something pretty fascinating about human nature. Americans who personally know a Muslim are significantly less likely to hold hostile views toward Islam, and I think this brilliantly illustrates how familiar human contact conquers fear. It wasn't because people were suddenly persuaded by complex theological arguments. No, it was because familiarity humanized what fear had simplified. When the perceived other becomes your coworker or your child's PTA parent or your friend, stereotypes just struggle to survive.
Let's look at this final massive number, 2 billion. That is nearly 2 billion human beings across every single continent on Earth. In fact, the world's largest Muslim population isn't even in the Middle East, it's in Indonesia. Islam is not a cable news slogan. It is not a terrifying headline. It is not ISIS, and it is certainly not Al-Qaeda. It is a complex, 1,400-year-old civilization. You may completely agree with its theology, or you may completely disagree with it. But as a global citizen, you deserve to understand it through its own authentic sources, not solely through the lens of its worst, most traumatic moments.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you with this final provocative thought. 25 years later, as we continue to respectfully honor the victims and wrestle with the legacy of 9/11, perhaps the most important question is no longer just what happened that day, but rather, did America ever truly understand the religion it spent a quarter century talking about? Serious understanding shouldn't be built on fear alone. If this explainer challenged something you thought you knew, we really encourage you to share it. Understanding grows through conversation, not fear. And please, leave a comment below for us. What question about Islam have you never heard answered properly? We read every single one. Thank you so much for joining us for this thoughtful look back. Here's to a future built on human connection. Keep seeking the truth.